So when I first went to seminary, I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do with a seminary degree. I was volunteering at the time with an organization called Young Life, and all I really knew was that I wanted to go to grad school, I didn't want to keep working at my current job anymore, and I wanted to be better equipped to answer the questions that my Young Life kids were asking about life and faith and God. Now, in my first semester, I took the introductory theology class required for all the degree programs and pretty quickly fell in love with theology. So I switched my degree to a Master of Arts in Theology, and I jumped in headfirst. It didn't take long, though, for me to begin to feel pretty out of my depth. Most of my theology classes were filled with people who studied theology and philosophy in undergrad, which I did not do. But that meant that much of our class discussions ended up staying high up in the clouds while I stayed pretty quiet, trying to soak in as much as I could. And at the end of the program, I had to write a final evaluation paper summarizing my time in seminary and then meet with one of the theology faculty members to talk about it. So I sent my paper off to Dr. Smith, and a few weeks later, we met in his office to debrief. Now, at this point, I had taken 2 different classes with Dr. Smith, but had never really had a conversation with him. His first comment when I sat down in his office, which I really appreciated, was how much he enjoyed getting to know me through my paper, but wished that I had been more outspoken in class so that he could have gotten to know me in person. So I was honest with him and told him that because of all the heady philosophical conversations in class, I didn't ever feel comfortable asking the question that I usually had, which was, so what difference does this make in our day-to-day lives? For instance, what difference does it make if the operations of the Trinity are inseparable or not? Or why does it matter that I understand the differences between philosophical theology and systematic theology and contemporary analytic theology? I took a class on that last one. I still don't know what it is, so. But I never asked because everybody else was up in the clouds, and I didn't want to seem dumb by bringing us all back down to earth. When I told Dr. Smith this, he responded saying, I really wish that you had asked, because those are the questions that everyone up in the clouds needed to be asking. They just didn't know it. Well, that was not what I was expecting, and yet the more I've reflected on it, the more I've appreciated Dr. Smith's response, especially because he wasn't saying that the high-level philosophical conversations weren't important. He was saying that we need the theoretical and the practical all together. They complement each other. The theoretical helps us understand what it is that we believe about God, while the practical helps us make sense of what to do with what we believe, as well as why what we believe about God matters. And I think the Apostle Paul would agree, because he gives us both the theoretical and the practical in the book of Romans. Right now, we're in a series going through the book of Romans called The Romans Road Less Traveled. And as a quick refresher, Paul wrote Romans to the church in Rome. Now, this particular church was dealing with some inner turmoil and conflict, and it had been established by a group of Jewish people, but eventually became primarily a church for the Gentiles. Gentiles included anyone who wasn't Jewish, but probably came from a variety of different backgrounds, ethnicities, and socioeconomic statuses. And after about 8 years as a primarily Gentile church, the Jews returned, but they didn't feel as comfortable and weren't sure where exactly they fit in at the church anymore. So, Paul uses a lot of references to Jewish law to help the Gentiles better understand the Jews and their history, while also helping the Jewish people better understand why the Gentiles are now able to be included in the people of God. So, if we look back at the first 11 chapters of Romans, Paul spends the majority of those first chapters hitting on some really broad themes. And he lays out a framework to help the Jews and Gentiles understand and identify what is important for them to believe about God, and how those beliefs about God support a theological foundation for unity within the church. And here in chapter 12 is where Paul takes all of that theology and theory that he's been talking about, and he gets really practical about why all of it matters, about what it all means for the church and for how they interact with one another so that they can better reflect God's heart for the world. To get just a little Bible nerdy about it, Paul has spent the last 11 chapters walking them through the story of Jesus, and the verbs he's used have primarily been indicatives, or verbs that show and describe. He's made a lot of declarations about what is true and what is not true. But in chapter 12, he begins using imperative verbs, or verbs that express commands. And he continues to use imperatives throughout the rest of the book as he invites the church to enter into the story that he has been telling and participate with Jesus in continuing to tell that same story through their life together. Fun fact you might not know about me, I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia, but I've lived in New England since I was 12, and while I have done everything in my power to seem like a New Englander, and the best compliment I've ever gotten from someone was asking if I was from Connecticut, those first 12 years in the South were pretty formative. And there are just a few things that are actually better in the South. There's sweet tea, grits, central air conditioning in every home and building. I really miss that. But most importantly, for this morning, the South has a single word that can be used specifically to address a large group of people. Y'all. Yeah. Yes, Matthew's favorite word. I mean, sure, you could just say you, but then how are you supposed to know if I'm addressing you, Hunter, or you, Ellen, or you, all of you? Enter y'all. Which is exactly the problem that we run into in Romans 12, and honestly, in many other parts of the Bible as well. At first reading, it would be easy to think that Paul is addressing a single person throughout the book of Romans. But in many parts of the book, he's using the plural you all, or y'all. So I'm going to go ahead and reread the first two verses of our passage this morning and replace the plural yous with y'all and emphasize where things are singular or plural so that we can get a better sense of what Paul is actually saying. And unfortunately, I'm not good at doing a Southern accent, so I won't do that, but I will say y'all. Ready? Okay. And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with y'all to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for y'all. Let them be a single, living, and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly, in other words, the true, informed, and mindful way to worship him. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform y'all by changing the way y'all think. Then you will learn to know God's will for y'all, which is good and pleasing and perfect. So, why does this matter? What difference does it make that Paul is using the Greek equivalent of y'all here instead of you? Well, I think it matters because we often read these verses as if Paul is speaking to each of us individually, instructing us to sacrifice our individual bodies and transforming our individual minds, which isn't necessarily a bad reading. Those are all still good things for each of us individually to consider and try to work towards. But it misses the broader communal vision that Paul has for the church. And the church in Rome wasn't looking like the church was supposed to, which I'm sure we can all relate to as well. But Paul here is imploring them together as a community to embody a new transformed society that functions as an example for what human society will look like when God's restoration of the world is complete. He wants the church to live out their faith in a way that is consistent with the truth of who Jesus is to them and to the world around them. And that is the same invitation that we are invited into as well today. We're not supposed to try to do our faith alone, but to allow our faith together as a body of believers to transform us into a community that looks different from the world around us. Because all too often, we don't look very different from the world around us, do we? But even more importantly, Paul is not asking them or us to become this kind of transformed community just because it's a nice thing to do. He's inviting us to become this kind of community as an act of worship. He's essentially saying, hey, remember everything I've told you up to this point about who God is and everything that he's done for you? The most authentic way to honor and thank him for the eternal sacrifice that he made in sending Jesus to die for you, to defeat death for you, to give you the Holy Spirit as a comfort and a guide, is to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice and allow God to change the way you think. Now, we tend to think of worship as just what happens when we sing on Sunday morning, or maybe what happens when we focus on God as much as we possibly can. But Paul is saying here that worship is about more than that. It's not just about focusing on God, and it's not just about singing more earnestly on Sunday morning. Those are both good things, but worship that is informed and knowledgeable about what God has done leads us to the renewing of our minds so that we are willing to offer our lives as a sacrifice to God. Which is why Paul has spent the whole first part of his letter laying out this theological framework so that the church understands the significance of what God has done for them. He wants them to be so moved by God and his love for them and for us that their minds will be transformed to desire to do God's good, pleasing, and perfect will. And that's what the renewal of our minds is about. It's about living a life in accord with the will of God. For the Jewish people in the church, it used to be clear how to follow the will of God because the whole law summarized God's will for what life should look like. But Paul has taken that law off its pedestal. So now they need to learn a new way to discern the will of God, but they don't need to look to the law. Instead, we look to the life and death of Jesus. So what does it look like for their minds to be transformed? For them and for us to not get sucked into being conformed to the world's way of thinking. For us to offer our whole selves in worship for what God has done. For the church to look and act like this new community of people who have the mind of Christ and desire to serve and follow God. Well, Paul spells it out throughout the rest of this chapter, as well as throughout the rest of the book. But let's take a look at the three main characteristics that he gives us here in chapter 12. In verses 3-5, he says, "Because of the privilege and authority God has given me, I give each of you this warning. Don't think you are better than you really are. Be honest in your evaluation of yourselves, measuring yourselves by the faith God has given us. Just as our bodies have many parts, and each part has a special function, so it is with Christ's body. We are many parts of one body, and we all belong to each other." So, our first characteristic of having a transformed mind is serving each other with humility and without competition. Now, it can be easy for us to get caught up in serving to make ourselves look good, or to try to prove how much better we are than someone else, or maybe even everyone else in the church, to prove that we give 80% of our time, while that person over there only gives 20% of their time. Or to compare how we serve the church to how someone else serves the church. To think that preaching is more important than setting up or greeting at the front door. Or to think that leading worship is more important than running ProPresenter or the soundboard. We have a tendency to think that leading is more important than serving, when in reality, serving is an equal gifting alongside leading. And Paul says that we all have a role to play, and each role is equally important to the healthy functioning of the church body. He encourages us to take an honest inventory of what our individual gift is, but to then go out and use that gift humbly for the sake of the body. He then gives some examples of how that can look, saying, "In his grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. So if God has given you the ability to prophesy, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. If your gift is serving others, serve them well. If you are a teacher, teach well. If your gift is to encourage others, be encouraging. If it is giving, give generously. If God has given you leadership ability, take the responsibility seriously. And if you have a gift for showing kindness to others, do it gladly." And when you think about it, isn't it easier to serve when you're doing something that you're really good at? Maybe Kids Commons and ProPresenter and Soul Food and Setup and Teardown aren't your thing, and that's okay. That doesn't make you any less a part of the body. But if those aren't your gifts, what is your gift? God has given gifts to each of us, and those gifts might vary throughout our lives depending on our season of life, but what is your gift now? And how can you use it to serve the church, or even to serve the local community, in a way that honors the gift that God has given to you? So, number one, serve each other with humility and without competition. Number two, love each other. Like, really, truly love each other. Paul says, don't just pretend to love others, really love them. Hate what is wrong, hold tightly to what is good, love each other with genuine affection, and take delight in honoring each other. When God's people are in need, be ready to help them. Always be eager to practice hospitality. Be happy with those who are happy, and weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with each other. Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people, and don't think you know it all. Now, Paul does not hold back in these verses, does he? But I think that's because love doesn't always come easily to us. It's easy to say that we love the people around us, but what does that really mean? Do you really show genuine affection to those that you love? Do you take delight in honoring your spouse, your siblings, your kids, your friends, the people sitting in the pews around you, by showing them how much you appreciate them or by being attentive to them? Or do you get caught up in distractions and forget to give them your full attention? Do you see the needs of others in the church around you and think, oh, someone else will take care of that? Or are you ready at all times to step in and offer an ear to listen or a hand to help? Are you excited with the people around you when they succeed? Or do you harbor resentment that they are making progress while you feel stuck? Do you find yourself neglecting to jump in and engage in certain ministries or service opportunities because you think the other people involved are beneath you, not interesting or smart enough for you, or because they hold a different political view than you? What would it look like if we allowed God's love to empower us and infuse our interactions with everyone we come into contact with? If we truly loved all of those around us with genuine affection? Now, N.T. Wright, a New Testament scholar, wrote a book in 2002 called All You Need Is Love, and in it he writes, "Love will always do what is good rather than what is evil, since this will be for the good of the other person," which is exactly the kind of love that Jesus has for us. He didn't want to die on the cross, but he laid down his life for our good. And there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. If our lives were so marked by doing good to everyone we encounter out of an overflow of our love for them, a love that reflects God's sincere and unconditional love for us, then we will begin to embody this transformed community that Paul describes here in these verses. Okay, so to recap, what does a community that has been transformed and renewed by God look like? They serve each other with humility and without competition. They really, truly love each other with genuine affection. And finally, number 3, they seek peace with everyone. Paul ends chapter 12 with probably some of his most countercultural instructions. He says, "Bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Dear friends, never take revenge. Leave that to the righteous anger of God. For the scriptures say, 'I will take revenge. I will pay them back,' says the Lord. Instead, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. Don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good." Now, I don't know about you, but these verses seem like the hardest to follow to me. Like, what do you mean I'm supposed to pray for God to bless people who offend me? Or that if someone is rude to me, that I can't be rude right back? That I can't retaliate when someone wrongs me? And after all of that, I'm supposed to feed them if they're hungry? Now, I do want to caveat this and say that living in peace with everyone doesn't mean that if someone is harming you in some way, whether physically, emotionally, or mentally, that you should just continue to let them harm you. Sometimes living in peace with everyone means finding a way to remove yourself or allowing others to help remove you from a harmful situation. Or it means being someone who helps remove others from harmful situations. But living in peace does mean that you don't then respond to the person harming you by harming them in some way, no matter how much you might feel like they deserve it. And no matter how bad the situation, no matter how much someone may need to get out and away, there is never a time that we can't pray for other people. And prayer changes not just the one that we're praying for, but it also changes us. And sometimes we're tempted to stop at "don't hurt the other person back" in our thinking of what it means to forgive like Jesus does. But Jesus takes his forgiveness way further. So we can actively, intentionally pray that God would be present to those who harm us, giving them what they need, praying for their good, and for them to experience the grace and mercy of Jesus. And the longer that we pray like that, the more we might actually come to desire the good for the other, even if we didn't in the beginning. Our minds begin to be transformed to the mind of Christ until we are actually grieved not just by the way the person hurt us, but by the way that person is themselves still hurting, still needing to recognize and experience the goodness of God, and to a point that we can genuinely rejoice if that happens. Because following Christ means not being conformed to the normal, natural human tendencies and desires that we see all around us, but being transformed by the renewing of our minds. And when so much of what we see in the world around us is people gaining power and prestige and wealth by bullying their way to the top, or not considering how their actions and decisions affect the people on the ground, it can be all too easy to give in to those desires, to try to bully our own way to the top, or to put someone on blast, or to make a snide remark, or to inflict just as much pain on them as they've inflicted on us. But this is why the story of the cross is so subversive. It looks at the destructive patterns of the world and flips them on their heads, and replaces them with a pattern that builds up and encourages rather than destroys. A pattern that offers wholeness to our souls as we seek to conquer evil by doing good, and put our trust in God that his righteousness and justice will prevail in every aspect of our lives and in the world around us. Which is why we don't need to punish others for the things they've done. It's not that we're supposed to ignore injustice, but we can take comfort in knowing that God cares about justice, and we can trust that he will be responsible ultimately for seeing that justice is done. It doesn't have to be a burden that we solely feel responsible for. Our responsibility is to live in peace with everyone around us so that we don't perpetuate the cycle of injustice. So, to have a transformed mind that compels us to offer our whole selves as a living sacrifice to God looks like serving each other with humility and without competition, really, truly loving each other, and seeking peace with everyone. Now, jumping back to the church in Rome, one of the odd things about Christianity compared to the surrounding religious rituals of first century Rome was that all the other religions required its people to make some kind of sacrificial offering of an animal or an object to the gods or to Yahweh. But Paul is telling them they don't need to do that anymore. Instead, he shows them the way of Jesus and tells them that their sacrifice, their act of worship, is to give God their very selves, to serve each other, love each other, and to seek peace. So, are there ways that we all can allow God to transform our minds as a community today? That we can seek to do his will? And not just say that we'll do it, but to actually do it? Is there someone that you don't have peace with that you can approach to make peace with? Is there someone in need, and how can we serve them? Is there someone that you haven't been paying attention to that you can show in a tangible way that you love them? Are there ways that we can serve others, love attentively, and seek peace together? For this is our true and proper worship. Would you pray with me?